What if history had taken a different turn? Picture a world where a single decision, a twist of fate, or an unexpected event altered the course of everything we know. The past is a fragile tapestry. Pull one thread, and the entire pattern unravels into something unrecognizable. That's the power of historical what-ifs. These aren't just idle musings. They're windows into parallel universes where empires rise and fall, where inventions never see the light of day, and where the faces on our currency might have been entirely different. Today, we're diving into 25 breathtaking scenarios that could have reshaped our world in ways you've never imagined. Think about the moments that defined humanity: wars won or lost by a hair's breadth, leaders who narrowly escaped assassination, technologies abandoned too soon. What if just one of those moments had gone the other way? The ripple effects would be staggering. A single change could mean no internet, no United States, or even a world where the Roman Empire never crumbled. History isn't set in stone. It's a series of precarious balances, and today we're tipping them over to explore the astonishing possibilities. This isn't just a journey through alternate history. It's a chance to see our own world in a startling new light. Every scenario we'll uncover forces us to ask, how much of our present was truly inevitable, and what does that say about the future we're building right now? From the battles that almost weren't won to the geniuses who nearly faded into obscurity, these stories will challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. So buckle up. By the time we're done, you'll never look at history the same way again. Alexander the Great stood at the edge of his known world in 3232 BC, his empire stretching from Greece to India. But what if he hadn't died at just 32? The fever that cut his life short didn't just end a reign, it might have snuffed out an entire alternate future. Historians whisper about his unfinished ambitions: invasions of Arabia, expeditions down Africa's coast, even campaigns into Europe's untamed west. Had he lived another decade, the Mediterranean might have become a Greek lake, with Alexandria-style cities dotting the sands of Arabia and the forests of Germania. Hellenistic culture was already spreading like wildfire, blending Greek thought with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions. But imagine that fusion reaching even deeper. Temples to Zeus could have risen in the Arabian Peninsula, while philosophers debated under the shadow of the Alps. His dream of uniting East and West wasn't just grand, it was a blueprint for a world where Greek became the universal language centuries before Latin. And Rome, that scrappy city-state, might never have gotten its chance. With Alexander's armies consolidating hold over Italy, the legions that built an empire could have been crushed before they ever marched. Yet the most fascinating twist isn't just territorial, it's cultural. The Library of Alexandria was just the beginning. More time might have meant a faster spread of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, accelerating human progress by generations. Or perhaps overextension would have shattered his empire faster, leaving a power vacuum even bloodier than our timeline's wars of the successors. Either way, one thing's certain: the man who wept because he had no more worlds to conquer might have rewritten history itself if only he'd had the time. A unified empire stretching from Athens to the Indus Valley wouldn't just redraw borders, it would rewire civilization's entire trajectory. Picture Silk Roads patrolled by Greek phalanxes, where Babylonian astronomers compare notes with Pythagoras' disciples in bustling trade hubs. Without the infighting that fractured Alexander's empire after his death, that network could have become history's first superhighway for ideas. The Hellenistic era already gave us Euclid's geometry and Archimedes' engineering marvels, but sustained unity might have supercharged innovation. Imagine Persian irrigation techniques meeting Greek mechanical ingenuity, producing steam-powered devices a millennium before the Industrial Revolution. Religions would dance to an entirely different rhythm. Zoroastrian fire temples might have incorporated Olympic gods into their pantheon, creating hybrid spiritual traditions that reshaped Judaism, Christianity, and Islam before they even emerged. The vibrant philosophical soup of Alexandria, where Egyptian mystics debated Aristotle's errors, could have spread eastward, perhaps preventing the knowledge destruction that came with Rome's later collapse. With Macedonian administrators ensuring stability from the Nile to the Ganges, the great libraries of Antioch and Babylon might have preserved scrolls that in our timeline were lost to mobs or mold. Then there's the tantalizing counterfactual of the Dark Ages. The Roman Empire's fall plunged Europe into centuries of fragmented learning, but a thriving Greco-Persian superstate could have maintained intellectual continuity. The works of Aristotle might have been studied continuously in Baghdad and Barcelona alike, with no need for medieval scholars to rediscover them via crumbling Arabic translations. Maritime trade networks linking Carthage to Calcutta could have prevented regional economic collapses, keeping metallurgy and medicine advancing steadily. Yet the greatest twist might be linguistic. Koine Greek was already the ancient world's lingua franca, but with stronger imperial backing, it could have become as permanent as Latin became in Europe. Modern scientists might today be writing papers in a language descended from Alexander's court dialects, with Sanskrit-derived words peppering their terminology. The very way we think about democracy, drama, and diplomacy would carry the imprint of a world where East and West truly fused, not through conquest, but through the cultural alchemy Alexander envisioned in his final fevered dreams. Flames crackled through the shelves of the Library of Alexandria, and with them vanished entire worlds of thought. This wasn't just the burning of books, it was the silencing of voices that had pondered the stars, charted the human body, and calculated the circumference of the earth centuries before their time. Suppose those flames had never touched parchment. Suppose scrolls containing the works of Aristotle, the treatises of Archimedes, and the star charts of Hipparchus had survived intact. The trajectory of human knowledge wouldn't just have shifted, it might have catapulted forward by a millennium. Take mathematics first. In our timeline, calculus emerged separately in the 17th century through Newton and Leibniz. But whispers from antiquity suggest scholars in Alexandria were already flirting with its concepts. Archimedes' method of exhaustion was essentially proto-calculus, a stepping stone toward understanding infinity and change. With continuous study rather than fragmented rediscovery, those ideas could have matured into full-fledged calculus by the early Middle Ages. Imagine Islamic Golden Age scholars building on that foundation, developing physics equations to predict planetary motion while Europe was still mired in feudal strife. The scientific revolution might have begun not in 1600 but in 800. Astronomy would have leaped ahead just as dramatically. Hipparchus' lost star catalogue contained positions of 850 celestial bodies, data so precise it rivaled Renaissance observations. Had it survived, Copernicus might not have needed to reinvent the wheel, or in this case the heliocentric model. A continuous chain of observation from Alexandria to Baghdad to Cordoba could have cemented sun-centered astronomy by the year 1000, sparing Galileo his heresy trial and giving navigators accurate star charts centuries before the age of exploration. The telescope, when finally invented, would have been aimed at skies already mapped with startling accuracy. Medicine presents perhaps the most heartbreaking loss. The library housed Herophilus anatomical studies, which correctly identified the brain as the seat of thought and nerves as conduits of sensation insights Europe wouldn't reclaim until Vesalius in the 1500s. With these texts preserved, germ theory might have emerged alongside Roman aqueducts, saving millions from plagues later blamed on miasmas or divine wrath. Surgical techniques described in Alexandrian scrolls, like cataract removals and tumor excisions, could have become routine practice rather than forgotten arts. Yet the greatest loss wasn't just specific discoveries, it was the culture of inquiry itself. Alexandria was a place where Egyptian alchemists debated Greek geometers, where Jewish scholars translated Babylonian astronomy into multiple languages. That cross-pollination of ideas created a feedback loop of innovation we've rarely matched since. With the library intact, the Dark Ages might never have darkened. The sheer momentum of preserved knowledge could have propelled humanity past medieval stagnation straight into an enlightenment powered by steam engines and microscopes. The Renaissance wouldn't have been a rebirth, it would have been an unbroken chain of brilliance stretching back to the ancient world's most luminous minds. Of course, survival alone wouldn't guarantee progress. Scrolls need readers, not just shelves. Political upheavals or religious dogma could still have suppressed ideas, as they did with Hypatia's murder. But in a world where the library stood as an eternal beacon, where scholars across continents could access Eratosthenes' calculations or Aristarchus' heliocentric proofs, resistance to knowledge would have faced something unprecedented, an unbroken lineage of truth stretching back 2,000 years. That's the real tragedy of the library's burning. We didn't just lose books, we lost alternate futures where humanity might have reached the stars while Rome still stood. Education in this alternate timeline wouldn't just advance, it would transform. Picture universities in medieval Paris or Bologna lecturing from Alexandrian texts instead of scrambling to reconstruct fragments. Students might have studied Eratosthenes' geography with accurate world maps, tracing coastlines from Britain to India centuries before European explorers set sail. Astronomy classes could have featured Hipparchus' star charts alongside Ptolemy's models, giving navigators precise celestial coordinates long before the age of discovery. The liberal arts curriculum, rather than rediscovering Aristotle through Arabic translations, might have expanded on his original works, blending them seamlessly with Babylonian mathematics and Egyptian medicine. Literacy itself could have spread faster, as the libraries preserved grammars and dictionaries standardized Greek as a global scholarly language, shrinking the gap between elite scholars and the common citizen. Medical practice would leap from superstition to science overnight. Galen's flawed theories, which dominated European medicine for 1,500 years, might have been corrected early by preserved texts from Herophilus, the first anatomist to differentiate nerves from blood vessels. Surgical manuals detailing cataract removals and cesarean sections could have become standard reference texts, saving countless lives lost to medieval trial and error. Most revolutionary, the library's collection likely included early germ theory observations. Roman engineers building aqueducts might have paired them with public health measures against contagion, preventing plagues that wiped out a third of Europe. Arabic physicians like Ibn Sina, instead of laboriously reconstructing Greek knowledge, could have built on intact Alexandrian texts to develop vaccines or antibiotics 1,000 years early. Governance and law would wear an entirely different face. Imagine Cicero studying not just Plato's Republic, but also lost works on constitutional theory from Egypt's priest scholars. Roman legal codes might have incorporated Mesopotamian contract law or Indian arbitration practices, creating a hybrid system far more adaptable than the rigid Justinian code. The Magna Carta could have drawn on older precedents for citizens' rights, while Machiavelli's Prince might have been a footnote compared to surviving political treatises on meritocracy from the Indus Valley. Even religions would evolve differently. Early Christian theologians debating in Alexandria had access to texts later deemed heretical. With those documents preserved, doctrines like reincarnation or gender equality might have remained part of mainstream thought, reshaping everything from the Crusades to the Reformation. Technological progress would accelerate in ways that seem almost magical. Archimedes' steam engine designs, dismissed as toys in our timeline, could have been refined into industrial machinery by the early Middle Ages. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek analog computer, wasn't a fluke but part of a tradition of gear-based mechanics. With those techniques unbroken, clockwork automation might have led to mechanical looms or printing presses by the year 800. Arabic alchemists working from intact Egyptian metallurgy scrolls could have skipped centuries of alchemical mysticism, isolating pure elements and alloying steel strong enough for suspension bridges or early skyscrapers. The most profound change, though, would be psychological. A world without the Dark Ages, where knowledge flowed continuously from antiquity, would breed generations certain of progress rather than fearing it. The Renaissance wouldn't have been a chaotic rebirth from ruins, but an orderly expansion of ideas preserved for 2,000 years. When Columbus set sail, his ships might have carried star charts accurate to within a degree, while his sponsors consulted economic treatises on global trade from Alexandrian merchants. The very concept of lost wisdom would be foreign, replaced by unshakable confidence in humanity's collective grasp of the universe. That's the true cost of the library's destruction, not just what we lost, but the certainty that we could have been so much more. The Roman legions carved an empire with steel and discipline, but what if they'd wielded something far more devastating: gunpowder? Imagine catapults hurling not just stones but explosive shells over Carthage's walls, or Praetorian guards armed with early arquebuses suppressing rebellions with thunderous volleys. China's serendipitous 9th century discovery reached Europe centuries too late to save Rome, but in this alternate timeline, a trader on the Silk Road might have delivered the recipe to Augustus' engineers instead. The consequences would have reshaped warfare, politics, and perhaps even the empire's very survival. With gunpowder at their disposal, Rome's military machine would have achieved near invincibility. Germanic tribes charging at Teutoburg Forest would have faced not just disciplined infantry, but cannon fire shredding their formations before contact. Rebellions like Boudicca's uprising could have been crushed with terrifying efficiency. Imagine ballistae modified to launch grapeshot into charging Celtic chariots. The empire's borders, constantly pressured by migrations, might have solidified into impregnable fortresses guarded by primitive mortars. Hadrian's Wall could have become a killing field where Pictish raiders met explosive traps rather than arrow volleys. The geopolitical ripple effects would dwarf mere battlefield supremacy. A gunpowder-armed Rome might never have split into eastern and western halves, as rapid-fire suppression of revolts could have maintained centralized control. Constantinople's Theodosian walls, formidable even to medieval cannon, would have been virtually unassailable with early firearms defending them. The Sasanian Persians, Rome's eternal rivals, might have been pushed back beyond the Tigris, turning Mesopotamia into a Roman breadbasket rather than a contested battleground. Most crucially, the 5th century migrations, Goths, Vandals, Huns, could have been halted in their tracks. The Western Empire's collapse wasn't inevitable, it was death by 1,000 cuts. Gunpowder would have cauterized those wounds instantly. Colonization and exploration would wear an unrecognizable face. Roman caravels armed with naval cannon might have crossed the Atlantic not in 1492, but by 700, establishing Nova Roma on Caribbean shores while Europe still languished in fragmented kingdoms. The empire's unmatched infrastructure could have supported transoceanic trade networks. Imagine Roman roads extending from Britannia to Brazil, with steam engines, another technology they toyed with, pulling shipments of gunpowder and gold. China's Zheng, he might have encountered Roman dreadnoughts in the Indian Ocean, sparking a cold war between history's two greatest empires rather than Europe's scramble for colonies. Yet the darkest twist lies in slavery and oppression. Rome's economy ran on human misery, and gunpowder could have made slave revolts like Spartacus even harder to succeed. Crucifixions might have been replaced by firing squads, while conquered peoples faced not just occupation but industrialized warfare. The moral progress that accompanied Christianity's rise could have been stifled under an empire that crushed dissent with explosives rather than philosophical debate. Alternatively, the sheer destructive power of firearms might have forced earlier reckonings with governance, perhaps accelerating democracy to avoid constant revolts. Technologically, the effects stagger the imagination. Roman engineers combined Greek theory with ruthless practicality. Given gunpowder, they'd likely have leapfrogged to rockets, landmines, and even early tanks within centuries. The scientific revolution might have emerged from legionary workshops rather than Renaissance salons, with Archimedes' heirs refining combustion chemistry while medieval Europe still prayed for divine intervention. Astronomy could have advanced faster as canon trajectories demanded precise understanding of physics, while metallurgy would surge to meet the demand for stronger barrels. The stuttering progress of our timeline, where gunpowder's potential lay dormant for centuries, would have become a headlong sprint toward industrialization. Religion and culture would bend under this new reality. Mithraism, the soldier's cult, might have evolved into a religion venerating the sacred fire of gunpowder, blending Zoroastrian flame worship with ballistic science. Christian martyrs executed by cannon rather than lions would have created radically different iconography, while Judaism's dispersal might have been prevented by Roman garrisons ruthlessly putting down rebellions with artillery. The Quran's verses could have spoken of iron birds that spit thunder, reshaping Islamic science toward chemistry rather than astronomy. Ultimately, Rome's survival would have created a world both wondrous and horrifying. The Dark Ages might never have darkened, preserving literacy, law, and engineering, but at what cost? Global unity under the eagle's shadow could have spared humanity feudal fragmentation, yet birthed an authoritarian superstate lasting 2 millennia. The Americas might speak Latin, and the moon's craters could bear names like Caesar's Landing. But perhaps the most chilling thought isn't how much would change, it's how much of Rome's cruelty and grandeur would have been amplified by the ultimate tool of control. The empire that gave us roads and aqueducts might also have given us total warfare 500 years early, proving that while gunpowder can defend civilizations, it can also freeze them in time. Rome's engineers were masterful adapters. Give them gunpowder, and they wouldn't stop at fireworks. The same minds that built aqueducts with millimeter precision and devised concrete that hardened underwater would have reverse-engineered this explosive powder into civilization-altering machinery. Picture imperial workshops where siege engineers tinkering with fire tubes stumble upon the basic principles of internal combustion. A society that produced the Antikythera mechanism's intricate gears wouldn't just weaponize gunpowder, they'd industrialize it. The leap from lobbing grenades to harnessing controlled explosions for pumps or propulsion might have taken mere decades rather than centuries. Steam power was already within their grasp. Hero of Alexandria's Eolipile, a spinning brass sphere powered by steam, was treated as a temple curiosity, but combine that with gunpowder's forceful expansion, and you have the makings of early piston engines. Roman mines in Hispania, choked by groundwater, could have deployed steam pumps powered by coal and gunpowder residues, dragging the empire kicking and screaming into mechanized labor. Imagine Tiber River barges fitted with paddle wheels driven by crude boilers, or cranes in Ostia's harbor lifting cargo with explosive-assisted hydraulics. The economic multiplier would have been staggering. More efficient mines mean more metal, enabling better tools which accelerate further innovations. A feedback loop that bypassed the medieval stagnation altogether. Manufacturing would transform first. The repetitive hammering of gladius blades or armor plating could have been semi-automated with trip hammers powered by gunpowder-driven pistons. Textile production in cities like Pompeii, reliant on manual looms, might have adopted mechanical weaving frames centuries before the flying shuttle. Even concrete production, Rome's signature material, would benefit from explosive pulverization of limestone and volcanic ash, increasing output to erect sprawling factory districts rather than just amphitheaters. The appetite for standardization, already evident in military gear like the lorica segmentata, could have birthed interchangeable parts long before Eli Whitney's muskets. Agriculture would undergo its own revolution. The heavy-wheeled plough didn't dominate European fields until the Middle Ages, but Roman latifundia estates desperate to feed a swelling population might have deployed explosive tilling-controlled charges to break up stubborn soil, followed by mechanical seed drills inspired by ballista mechanisms. Grain mills, traditionally dependent on slaves or donkeys, could have shifted to steam-powered grinding stones, boosting bread production to sustain urban megacities approaching 1 million residents. Vineyards might have employed pressurized sprinkler systems derived from firefighting pumps, while olive presses could adopt hydraulic presses scaled up from siege engine designs. The societal impacts would be as explosive as the technology itself. Skilled slaves, architects, metalworkers, and chemists from conquered territories might have formed an early technical class maintaining these machines, blurring the lines between servitude and indispensability. The traditional patron-client system could have morphed into something resembling industrial capitalism, with wealthy senators investing in engine houses the way Renaissance bankers backed trading voyages. Urbanization would accelerate as factories demanded concentrated labor, potentially weakening the agrarian power base that sustained the old patrician elite. The Gracchi brothers' land reforms, which aimed to redistribute farms to soldiers, might have pivoted toward regulating factory conditions instead. Cultural attitudes toward innovation would flip dramatically. Where our timelines, Romans often prized Greek philosophy over Banosic crafts, the tangible rewards of mechanization could have elevated engineers to near-sage status. The writings of Vitruvius, Rome's premier architect, might have been expanded into comprehensive engineering manuals studied as fervently as Virgil's poetry. Even religion could adapt. Vulcan, the smith god, might have risen to Jupiter's prominence as the patron of pistons and forges, with temples doubling as technical schools. Stoicism's focus on rational order would dovetail perfectly with the systematization of production, creating an intellectual framework for industrialization that Protestant work ethic provided in our 18th century. Yet this path wouldn't be without peril. The same authoritarian structures that built roads and legions could have turned industrialization into a dystopian nightmare. Imagine slave-run factories powered by gunpowder turbines where insurrections are quashed with handheld cannons. Environmental degradation, already evident in Roman lead mining, might have spiraled with coal smoke choking the Seven Hills, turning the Tiber into a toxic runoff channel centuries before London's Great Stink. The empire's insatiable appetite for resources could have triggered wars of extraction against Germania and Persia, fought with machine-spit projectiles rather than gladius blades. Most intriguing is the potential collapse dynamic. Our Rome fell to migration pressures and economic stagnation, but an industrialized empire might have succumbed to revolutions powered by the very machines it created. Rebellious proletariat armed with stolen steam guns could have toppled the Senate, or perhaps competing industrialists would have fractured the empire into corporate city-states. Alternatively, sustained technological superiority might have allowed Rome to endure as a globe-spanning superpower, its legions clad in steam-assisted armor, colonizing the Americas with ironclad ships while Han China remained silkworm farmers. The 20th century could have dawned with a Roman moon landing, Latin echoing in vacuum-sealed helmets, proof that once innovation's genie escapes its flask, even an empire built on swords can remake the world. The streets of 14th century Europe lay silent, choked with the dead whole villages emptied, cities reduced to ghost towns. The Black Death claimed 1 in 3 lives, but what if its toll had been far worse? Imagine a world where 9 out of 10 Europeans perished, where the feudal system didn't just stagger but collapsed entirely under the weight of unimaginable loss. The survivors wouldn't have rebuilt the world they knew, they'd have forged something entirely new while other continents seized the reins of history. With Europe's population decimated, the power vacuum would have drawn in forces from every direction. The Islamic world, already thriving from Andalusia to Bengal, might have expanded unchecked. Mamluk Egypt, spared the plague's worst effects, could have pushed into Italy, turning the Mediterranean into an Islamic lake. The famed libraries of Timbuktu, enriched by trans-Saharan gold trade, might have become the new centers of learning as Oxford and Paris faded into ruin. And in the east, Ming China's treasure fleets already venturing to Africa could have established permanent colonies on Europe's corpse, their bureaucrats administering vacant lands repopulated by Chinese settlers. Economic systems would have shattered first. Feudalism relied on serfs to work the land, but with no one left to till the soil, surviving lords would have abandoned their castles for desperate bands of scavengers. The scarcity of labor might have accelerated technological adoption, windmills and water wheels replacing dead workers, triggering an early industrial revolution born not of ingenuity but necessity. Conversely, without enough mines to maintain complex systems, Europe could have reverted to hunter-gatherer subsistence in some regions, its few survivors clinging to superstition as forgotten lathes and looms rusted in abandoned workshops. Cultural and religious shifts would be even more profound. Christianity, already fractured by the trauma of the plague, might have splintered into localized cults worshipping saints of survival. The Vatican, its authority gutted by the loss of clergy, could have seen its influence replaced by mystical movements blending pagan rites with desperate prayers. Meanwhile, Islam, with its advanced medicine and cohesive legal systems, might have seemed like the only beacon of order, converting the disillusioned masses. Jewish communities, often scapegoated during the plague, could have either been annihilated entirely or emerged as crucial intermediaries between surviving Christian towns and Islamic traders. Africa's rise would have been the most dramatic reversal. The Mali Empire, already wealthier than any European kingdom, might have expanded northward into vacant Spain and Sicily, its gold-backed economy becoming the global standard. Swahili city-states along Africa's east coast, long the hub of Indian Ocean trade, could have dispatched ships to claim abandoned European ports, creating a mercantile network spanning from Kilwa to Copenhagen. Even the Americas might have entered the global stage centuries earlier. Without European diseases ravaging indigenous populations, civilizations like the Aztec or Inca could have encountered African or Chinese explorers on equal footing, trading goods and ideas rather than falling to conquest. Technologically, the world's center of gravity would have shifted east. Gunpowder, printing, and compass innovations, all Chinese inventions, might never have been transmitted to a near-extinct Europe. Instead of Galileo, we could be celebrating the breakthroughs of Arab astronomers who refined their lenses without crusader interruptions. The scientific method might have emerged from Samarkand's observatories rather than Padua's universities, with algebra and chemistry leading the charge instead of Newtonian physics. Yet the darkest twist lies in humanity's collective memory. Europe's Renaissance drew heavily on rediscovered classical texts, but with no scholars left to preserve them, Aristotle and Plato might have been forgotten entirely. The plays of Shakespeare, the art of Da Vinci, none of it would exist. Our cultural touchstones could instead be the epics of Sundiata Keita or the porcelain masterpieces of Ming artisans. The very definition of civilization would center on Timbuktu's universities or Kerala's spice routes, with Europe remembered only as a cautionary tale of collapse. This alternate world forces us to question the inevitability of Western dominance. Was Europe's ascent just a fluke of geography and immunity, or does power always find a way to shift like water carving new channels through broken land? One thing is certain, the plague didn't just kill people, it nearly killed an entire future. And in its wake, the paths not taken whisper of civilizations that might have been, had history's scales tipped just a little further. Without the Renaissance's explosion of art, science, and commerce, the torch of progress might have passed to entirely different hands. Picture Baghdad's House of Wisdom not just surviving the Mongol sack, but flourishing into a beacon of perpetual learning, its scholars synthesizing Greek logic, Indian mathematics, and Persian astronomy into an unbroken tradition of inquiry. Or envision the Swahili coast stone cities becoming the Venice of the Indian Ocean, their merchant princes funding observatories and poets while Europe languished in primitive isolation. The Renaissance wasn't inevitable. It was a fragile alignment of rediscovered knowledge, economic surplus, and political stability. Remove even one pillar and the edifice crumbles. The most immediate casualty would be artistic expression. In our timeline, the Medicis patronage birthed masterpieces like Michelangelo's David, but without Florence's banking wealth, such commissions might have come from Malian Mansas instead. Timbuktu's Sankore University could have produced its own Leonardo, blending intricate Arabic calligraphy with sub-Saharan bronze casting techniques. Islamic architecture, already soaring with the domes of the Alhambra, might have evolved into a global style, its geometric precision inspiring temples from Java to the Andes. Even music would diverge. The polyphony of Palestrina could have been replaced by the complex rhythms of West African griots, transmitted worldwide by trans-Saharan trade routes. Scientific advancement would follow radically different contours. Europe's Renaissance drew heavily on Arabic translations of Greek texts, but with the Islamic world as the dominant intellectual force, those works might never have migrated westward. Instead of Newton pondering gravity under an English apple tree, we could have Persian physicists in Isfahan refining Alhazen's optics into telescopes powerful enough to map Jupiter's moons by the 1500s. Medical breakthroughs would likely center on the empirical traditions of the Ayurvedic and Unani systems, with surgery advancing through Indian steel scalpels rather than European barbers' tools. The printing press, often credited with democratizing knowledge, might have emerged first in Korea's Joseon dynasty, their movable metal type spreading Confucian classics across Asia while Europe still relied on monastic scribes. Economic power would pivot eastward. The Venetian-dominated spice trade could have been supplanted by Omani merchants controlling routes from Zanzibar to Canton, their house carrying not just nutmeg and silk but treatises on algebra and mechanical engineering. The Aztec Triple Alliance, undisturbed by Spanish conquest, might have evolved into a mercantile empire trading chocolate and obsidian for Ming porcelain, creating a trans-Pacific economy centuries before the Manila galleons. Europe, stripped of its late medieval commercial revival, could have remained a backwater of subsistence farming, its would-be explorers starved of funding for overseas voyages. The darkest implication lies in colonialism's erasure or redistribution. Without European guns, germs, and steel, the Americas might have encountered very different colonizers. Chinese treasure fleets, venturing beyond their historical turnback point at East Africa, could have established trading posts in California while the Incas industrialized their terraced agriculture. West African empires, enriched by direct trade with the New World, might have reversed the slave trade's direction, importing European captives to work plantations in Dahomey. The moral contours of exploitation wouldn't disappear, but the faces of oppressor and oppressed would be unrecognizable, yet the most profound change would be philosophical. The Renaissance birthed humanism, the belief in individual potential, but other traditions might have centered collective wisdom instead. Confucian meritocracy could have fused with Islamic legal scholarship to create global governance models prioritizing civil service exams over hereditary monarchy. Indigenous concepts of ecological balance preserved without colonial disruption might have shaped industrial practices, preventing the rampant deforestation and pollution of our timeline. Even the concept of progress itself would wear different clothing, not a linear march toward domination, but a spiral of harmony between technology and tradition. This alternate path forces us to confront the accident of Eurocentrism. what we consider universal history is just one thread in a tapestry of infinite possibilities. The music of Mozart, the plays of Shakespeare, the paintings of Rembrandt all might never have been, replaced by traditions equally profound yet utterly alien to our ears and eyes. The true lesson isn't that Europe's rise was unjust, but that it was never guaranteed. Other civilizations stood equally poised for greatness, their potential snuffed out not by inferiority, but by the cruel arithmetic of plague deaths and the timing of monsoon winds. History doesn't favor the destined, it favors the survivors, and in a world where the Renaissance never flickered to life, the light of human achievement would have simply dawned elsewhere. The thunder of hooves echoed across the frozen Danube in 1241, as Batu Khan's golden horde prepared to ravage Europe until news of the Great Khan's death forced their retreat. But what if that messenger had never arrived? Picture Mongol Tumans surging unchecked past Vienna, their recurved bows outranging European crossbows while siege engines flattened stone castles like sandcastles. Within a decade, the Papal States might have paid tribute to Karakorum. Paris could have become a provincial capital under a Mongol governor, and the British Isles might have faced the same choice as Kievan Rus: surrender or face annihilation. A fully conquered Europe wouldn't just redraw maps, it would rewire the DNA of global power structures for centuries to come. Trade routes would have been the first transformation. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they connected. The famed Pax Mongolica already linked the South China Sea to the Mediterranean, but adding Europe's Atlantic ports could have created a truly globe-spanning network. Venetian merchants might have sourced silks directly from Hangzhou via secure overland routes, bypassing the volatile Middle East. The Hanseatic League's fledgling Baltic trade could have fused with Mongol-controlled Russian river systems, funneling Norwegian timber and Flemish wool to markets in Beijing. Most crucially, this superhighway of commerce might have prevented the European desperation for sea routes to Asia that spurred Columbus and da Gama's voyages. Why brave the unknown Atlantic when safe caravan trails stretched all the way to Cathay? Religious landscapes would shift just as dramatically. Unlike the doctrinaire Christianity of medieval Europe, Mongol Khans practiced astonishing tolerance. In this alternate timeline, Buddhists, Muslims, and Nestorian Christians might have worshipped openly in the shadow of Notre Dame, while papal edicts held no more authority than the pronouncements of a Buddhist lama. The Inquisition's fires could have been extinguished by Mongol administrators more interested in tax rolls than theology. Judaism, perpetually persecuted in Europe, might have flourished under the same protections it enjoyed in Mongol-ruled Persia. Over generations, this spiritual free market could have birthed radical syncretism. Imagine a Parisian version of Tibetan Buddhism blended with Celtic mysticism, or Italian Sufis composing poetry in Occitan. Warfare would evolve at a terrifying pace. European knights clinging to chivalric traditions would have been outmaneuvered by Mongol light cavalry using feigned retreats and horse archery, tactics that had crushed far more advanced armies in Persia and China. The survivors might have adapted, creating hybrid forces where armored men at arms fought alongside steppe horsemen. Gunpowder, which the Mongols transmitted westward from China, could have reached Europe decades earlier, not as a curiosity but as a standard weapon. Picture the 100 Years' War fought with primitive rockets and grenades, or Mongol-trained English longbowmen deploying explosive arrows against French knights. The military revolution that took Europe centuries might have been compressed into generations under the whip of Mongol discipline. The most profound ripple could have been the prevention of colonialism itself. Europe's age of exploration was born from block trade routes and competitive fragmentation, but a Mongol Eurasia would have offered neither. Unified empires rarely engage in the desperate gambles that sent Portugal around Africa or Spain across the Atlantic. The Americas might have remained undisturbed until Aztec or Incan explorers crossed the Pacific on balsa rafts. Africa could have developed on its own terms without the slave trade's devastation. The Industrial Revolution, historically fueled by colonial exploitation, might have emerged instead from Mongol workshops in Krakow or Lyon, its benefits and horrors distributed very differently across the globe. Yet the empire's instability lurked beneath its brilliance. Even as the Mongols knit continents together, their succession crises tore them apart. A Europe under Khanate rule might have fragmented along similar lines, with rival descendants of Genghis fighting over Parisian palaces instead of Central Asian steppes. The Black Death, which traveled Mongol trade routes with gruesome efficiency, could have arrived even sooner, depopulating a Europe already strained by conquest. Alternatively, the sheer administrative challenge of ruling from the Seine to the Yellow River might have forced innovations in governance, perhaps an early form of federalism or meritocratic bureaucracy that reshaped power for the modern age. The legacy of such a world lingers in tantalizing fragments. Our timeline's renaissance drew on Greek texts preserved by Arab scholars and transmitted through Mongol peace. A fully conquered Europe might have seen Aristotle studied in Oxford alongside Confucius, with Avicenna's medical canon as standard as Galen's. The very concept of the West could have dissolved into a broader Eurasian identity, where a scholar in Bordeaux saw himself as kin to one in Samarkand. The Mongol Empire at its height was less a dictatorship than a brutal meritocracy, where a Christian Armenian or a Muslim Persian could rise as high as their talents allowed. In that light, the darkest irony isn't how much violence their conquests wrought, but how much unity they almost achieved. A Mongol-ruled Europe wouldn't just bridge continents, it would smash them together at breathtaking speed. Picture Venetian glassmakers sharing techniques with Chinese porcelain artisans in Karakoram's workshops, while Persian mathematicians collaborate with Oxford clerics on astronomical charts. The Silk Road's trickle of ideas would have become a flood, with innovations ricocheting across Eurasia decades or even centuries earlier than in our timeline. Gunpowder, already spreading westward under Mongol protection, might have reached European smithies by the late 1300s, transforming medieval warfare before the 100 Years' War even began. Printing technology, pioneered in China, could have been adapted to Latin alphabets by Franciscan monks serving as scribes in Mongol courts, democratizing knowledge long before Gutenberg's press. Even mundane advancements like crop rotation or horse collars might have leapfrogged from the agricultural heartlands of China to the fields of France, boosting yields enough to prevent famines that historically triggered peasant revolts. The epidemiological consequences would be equally staggering. The Black Death likely entered Europe via Crimean trading posts under Mongol control. In this scenario, the pandemic might have arrived even sooner, carried by administrators shuttling between Xanadu and Paris. But with a unified empire coordinating responses, quarantine measures could have been implemented continent-wide, potentially saving millions. Alternatively, the sheer density of Mongol postal relay stations where riders changed horses every 30 kilometers might have accelerated the plague's spread, depopulating Europe before its societies could adapt. The immunological ripple effects would reshape demographics. Survivors with partial resistance could have repopulated the continent with hardier gene pools, while indigenous Americans meeting Mongol European explorers centuries later might have faced a less devastating wave of virgin soil epidemics. Cultural fusion would redefine art, cuisine, and even language. The Mongol aristocracy's taste for Persian miniatures might have blended with Gothic illumination, creating a vibrant new visual style where elongated saints rode composite steeds of European and Asian descent. Parisian chefs could have incorporated saffron and noodles into their kitchens, while Italian vintners exported wine to a suddenly accessible Chinese market. Linguistically, Latin might have absorbed Turkic and Persian loanwords through imperial bureaucracy, creating a hybrid administrative language as flexible as English became in our timeline. The very concept of European identity would dissolve into a broader Eurasian consciousness, where a scholar in Cologne might study Confucian classics alongside Aquinas theology, seeing no contradiction between the two. The geopolitical ramifications would echo for millennia. Without fragmented European states competing for overseas trade routes, the age of exploration might never have gained momentum. Portuguese caravels wouldn't need to brave Africa's coast if Venetian-Mongol joint ventures already controlled secure overland paths to the Spice Islands. The Americas could have remained untouched until Aztec merchants, having acquired Mongol-brought metallurgy, launched their own voyages across the Pacific. Africa's great empires, Mali, Ethiopia, Great Zimbabwe, might have engaged with Eurasia as equals rather than targets of extraction, trading gold and ivory for steel and gunpowder on their own terms. Yet the most intriguing possibility lies in governance. The Mongols practiced a form of meritocracy unheard of in feudal Europe, promoting administrators based on skill rather than birth. A surviving Pax Mongolica might have seeded these ideas early, creating hybrids like parliamentary systems with elected khans or Buddhist-inspired legal codes that prioritized communal harmony over divine right. The Enlightenment's ideals of secularism and rationalism could have emerged from Mongol-sponsored debates between Islamic philosophers, Christian scholastics, and Buddhist logicians centuries before Voltaire was born. The darkest twist, this connected world might have been both more enlightened and more vulnerable. A unified Eurasia could have marshaled resources to repel the Turkic conqueror Timur when he rose in the late 1400s, preventing his rampage that historically set back Islamic science. But it also would have presented a single target for later catastrophes when the Little Ice Age struck. Crop failures might have cascaded from Normandy to Nanjing without regional buffers. The same trade networks that spread innovation could have transmitted collapse, turning local famines into global crises. Ultimately, the Mongol near miss reveals how tightly our modern world hangs on the thread of 13th century choices. Their retreat from Europe wasn't just a historical footnote, it was the fork in the road between the fractured, competitive continents we know and a unified supercontinent that might have either soared to unprecedented heights or imploded under its own interconnected weight. The difference between those two worlds hinges on a single horseman's message and the alternate universe where he arrived a day later. The Channel churned beneath the Spanish Armada's towering galleons as they closed in on England's vulnerable coast in 1588. But what if those ships had landed? Picture Spanish tercios marching through Kent, their pikes glinting as London's Protestant elite fled north. A victorious Philip II wouldn't have just deposed Elizabeth. He'd have rewired the Reformation, reshaped the New World, and forged a Catholic superpower stretching from the Andes to the Scottish Highlands. The consequences would ripple far beyond altered church attendance. They might have prevented the British Empire from ever existing. First, the religious landscape fractures differently. Elizabeth's England was Protestantism's defiant stronghold, funding Dutch rebels against Spain and sheltering Puritan radicals. With Catholicism forcibly restored, Geneva's reformers lose their most powerful patron. The Dutch revolt might have collapsed without English support, leaving the Spanish Netherlands permanently under Habsburg control. Scotland's Presbyterians, suddenly bordering a Catholic superstate, could have faced militant conversion campaigns, or perhaps formed an unlikely alliance with Lutheran Sweden against Spanish encroachment. Most crucially, the pilgrims sailing on the Mayflower would never have gotten their chance. Without religious persecution in England, there's no motivation to cross the Atlantic. America's foundation as a Protestant refuge vanishes before the first log cabin is built. Colonization takes a dramatically Catholic turn. Spanish Florida and Mexico already bordered English Virginia in our timeline, but under unified rule, the entire eastern seaboard might have become Nueva Inglaterra, a northern extension of the vice-royalty system. The brutal encomienda labor system, which extracted silver from Potosi, could have been imposed on Cherokee and Iroquois lands. Jamestown's settlers might have arrived to find Spanish missions already dotting the Chesapeake, their Bibles written in Latin rather than King James English. French Huguenots attempting settlements in Carolina would face the full wrath of the Inquisition rather than competing with Anglican traders. The map of North America could have featured cathedral cities like Santiago de Massachusetts instead of Puritan meeting houses. European power dynamics shift catastrophically for Protestant nations. Without England as a counterweight, Spain dominates both the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The Dutch Golden Age might never bloom as Amsterdam's stock exchange remains a backwater fish market. Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, would lack allies for his Protestant crusade during the 30 Years' War, leaving Germany entirely under Habsburg influence. Even France's delicate Catholic-Protestant balance tilts decisively. With Spanish armies able to cross the Channel at will, Paris has no room to maneuver against Habsburg encirclement. By 1600, Europe could resemble a monochromatic religious bloc, its universities teaching Aquinas instead of Newton, and its artists painting counter-Reformation altarpieces rather than Dutch still life. The economic repercussions might have been even more transformative. Spain's infamous inflation caused by New World silver was already straining its economy. Adding England's nascent capitalist networks, wool trade, joint stock companies, naval stores could have either stabilized the empire or accelerated its collapse. English privateers like Drake and Raleigh, instead of plundering Spanish galleons, might have been pressed into service guarding them, turning the Caribbean into a Spanish lake. The slave trade's trajectory shifts dramatically. Without English ships dominating the Middle Passage, the transatlantic traffic might have remained a Portuguese-Spanish monopoly, altering everything from Brazilian demography to southern plantation culture. Cultural cross-pollination presents fascinating possibilities. Shakespeare, just beginning his career in 1588, might have written plays for Madrid's Chorales theatres instead of London's Globe, his histories glorifying El Cid rather than Henry V. The King James Bible, that cornerstone of English literature, would never exist. Instead, the Douay-Rheims Catholic translation becomes the standard text for Anglophones. Spanish architectural styles, Moorish-influenced arches, ornate plateresque facades could have dominated English skylines, with Westminster Abbey remodeled to resemble Seville's cathedral. Even the English language absorbs Castilian flavors. Modern speakers might pepper conversations with gracias instead of thank you and siesta rather than nap. Yet the darkest twist lies in imperial overextension. Spain's empire was already straining under global commitments from Manila to Milan. Adding rebellious England to that burden might have triggered collapse decades earlier, or alternatively, forced administrative reforms that strengthened the whole system. A Spanish-speaking world superpower lasting into the industrial age could have meant earlier abolition. Spanish kings were often more skeptical of slavery than English capitalists, but also more centralized authoritarianism. The Enlightenment's democratic ideals, historically nurtured in England's coffeehouses and France's salons, might have been stillborn under unified Catholic censorship. The Armada's failure wasn't just a naval upset, it was the moment Protestant capitalism won its right to exist. Without that victory, the modern world loses not just a language and a religion, but an entire philosophy of decentralized power and mercantile ambition. The Spanish wave that almost drowned England would have left in its wake a planet where the sun never set on Habsburg tercios rather than British redcoats, and where the very idea of Anglo-Saxon values might refer only to long-vanquished heretics. With Spanish galleons permanently anchored in London's Thames, the Americas would have worn an entirely different face. No Jamestown, no Plymouth Rock. Instead, the eastern seaboard becomes an extension of New Spain's rigid hierarchy governed by viceroys, policed by the Inquisition, and worked by indigenous laborers under the encomienda system. The Powhatan Confederacy spared the English settlers aggressive land grabs, might have survived as vassals providing maize and deerskins to Catholic missions. But further south, the Aztec and Inca remnants could have faced intensified exploitation. Their surviving nobility folded into Spanish colonial administration as glorified tax collectors for Madrid. The silver mines of Potosi, already hellish, might have expanded northward with forced labor from Cherokee and Iroquoian captives, fueling a transatlantic economy even more dependent on human suffering. Religious conversion would have spread like wildfire. Franciscan friars, backed by Spanish garrisons, could have erected missions from the Chesapeake to the Great Lakes, baptizing thousands under the threat of pikes. The Puritan vision of a city upon a hill is replaced by cathedral spires towering over communal pueblos where native children learn Latin catechisms. Syncretism would take strange forms. Imagine Huron warriors blending Catholic saints with forest spirits, or Pueblo artists painting the Virgin Mary with cornstalk halos. The Jesuits, historically flexible in adapting local customs, might have preserved more indigenous languages than English settlers ever did, creating hybrid liturgical texts in Algonquin or Nahuatl. Yet resistance would simmer beneath the surface, erupting in revolts like the Pueblo Rebellion of 1680, only this time crushed by reinforcements shipped directly from occupied England. The slave trade's trajectory twists into something even more harrowing. Without English and Dutch ships competing for human cargo, the Middle Passage becomes a Spanish-Portuguese monopoly. Enslaved Africans might have been funneled not just to Caribbean sugar plantations but to tobacco fields in Virginia and silver mines in Appalachia. The racial caste system of New Spain, with its intricate classifications of mestizo, mulatto, and zambo, could have been imposed continent-wide, calcifying social divisions for centuries. Yet there's a grim irony. Spanish laws, however inconsistently enforced, granted slaves certain rights English colonies denied. A unified Catholic Americas might have seen more frequent manumissions or even earlier abolitionist movements rooted in Dominican friars' critiques of bondage. Cultural fusion would rewrite the hemisphere's identity. The English language, never dominant north of Mexico, might have persisted only in smuggled Protestant Bibles or pirate enclaves along the Carolina coast. Instead, a Creole Spanish laced with Taino, Nahuatl, and Algonquin loanwords becomes the lingua franca from Buenos Aires to Quebec. The American Enlightenment, historically shaped by Locke and Paine, could have emerged from Jesuit reductions where Guarani scholars debated Thomist philosophy. Even cuisine diverges, no turkey and cranberries at Thanksgiving, but instead, a continent eating tamales on Christmas Eve and drinking chocolate spiced with amaranth. The darkest legacy might be environmental. Spanish colonial economies prioritized resource extraction, gold, silver, dye woods over sustainable agriculture. The vast forests of New England, cleared for English-style farms in our timeline, might have been stripped for ship masts to supply the Armada's endless needs. Bison herds roaming the Great Plains could have been hunted to extinction centuries earlier to feed silver miners. Conversely, Spain's messed system of regulated pastures might have prevented the soil exhaustion that ruined English colonies' tobacco fields, preserving fertility for longer. Yet the most startling divergence lies in geopolitics. Without British naval power to challenge them, the Spanish could have pushed west from St. Augustine and east from Manila simultaneously, meeting somewhere in the Pacific to claim the entire continent. Russian trappers in Alaska might have found themselves negotiating not with Jefferson's envoys but with hardened veteranos of the Flanders Tercios, the Louisiana Purchase. Unthinkable Napoleon would have had no North American foothold to sell. The United States' very existence hinges on Protestant England's survival as a counterbalance. Remove that, and the 19th century becomes a showdown between Spanish Manila and Spanish Santa Fe over who controls the Rockies. This alternate Americas forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about historical contingency. The same ships that carried smallpox and slavery also brought guitars, universities, and the concept of universal human dignity. Spanish rule might have been brutal, but its centralized bureaucracy could have prevented the chaotic violence of frontier settler colonialism. Indigenous nations, though subjugated, might have retained more land and legal standing under Spain's paternalistic system than under Anglo-expansionism. The real tragedy isn't that one empire won, it's that none found a way to coexist. The fields of Waterloo lay trampled under French cavalry charges as Napoleon's guns finally shattered Wellington's lines. In this alternate June 1815, the emperor's last gamble doesn't fail. It rewrites the destiny of a continent. A victorious Napoleon wouldn't just extend his rule, he'd cement revolutionary ideals into Europe's bones. The ripple effects would stretch from Atlantic ports to the steppes of Russia, freezing the map in an authoritarian modernity where nationalism withered under imperial eagles and German unification became an impossible dream. First, the political landscape solidifies under French hegemony. The Congress of Vienna's delicate balance of power unravels overnight. Prussia, already humiliated, might have been dissolved entirely, its eastern lands carved up between a resurrected Poland and Russia, while the Rhineland became a permanent French satellite. Austria's fragile multi-ethnic empire could have collapsed under renewed military pressure, with Hungarian revolts encouraged by Napoleonic agents. Even Britain, deprived of its continental allies, might have been forced into an uneasy truce that recognized French control over the Low Countries. The United States of Europe, Napoleon once envisioned, wouldn't be a democratic federation but a coerced empire held together by marechals and prefects reporting directly to Paris. Legal reforms would have spread like wildfire. The Napoleonic Code, already imposed from Naples to Warsaw, might have become Europe's universal jurisprudence, abolishing feudal privileges, standardizing property rights, and crucially suppressing local legal traditions that nurtured regional identities. German principalities clinging to ancient customs would have seen their patchwork of laws replaced by uniform French statutes. Jewish emancipation, pioneered under Napoleon, could have advanced faster in places like Prussia or Bavaria, but at the cost of cultural assimilation. The very notion of Germanic law might have faded into obscurity, taking with it the legal foundations for later nationalist movements. Economic integration would follow political control. The continental system, Napoleon's embargo against British trade, might have evolved into a permanent protectionist bloc. Factories in the Ruhr and Silesia would produce goods for French markets rather than competing internationally, stunting the industrial rise of German states. The Zollverein, the customs union that historically paved the way for German unification, would never form under watchful French administrators. Even the railways crisscrossing Europe by the mid-19th century might have followed radial designs centered on Paris, physically binding the continent to France's economic engine. Cultural domination presents the subtlest yet most enduring shift. French wouldn't just be the language of diplomacy, it could have become the compulsory medium of education from Lisbon to Lübeck. German intellectuals like Goethe or Hegel might have written their masterpieces in French to reach wider audiences. Universities in Heidelberg or Berlin, instead of becoming nurseries of nationalism, would have trained bureaucrats versed in Cartesian logic and Napoleonic administration. The brothers Grimm wouldn't collect Germanic folktales to preserve cultural identity. They'd be compiling dictionaries to help their countrymen speak proper Parisian French. The most profound casualty would be German unification. Without Prussia's resurgence after Waterloo, there's no Bismarck to engineer it. No Königgrätz in 1866 where Prussian needle guns shred Austrian hopes of leadership. No Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to birth the German Empire in Versailles' Hall of Mirrors. Instead, the German-speaking world remains fractured: Bavaria, a French client kingdom; Saxony, a grand duchy ruled by Napoleon's nephews; Hanover, a British curiosity preserved only through dynastic whim. The industrial might that fueled Germany's rise in our timeline might have been harnessed for French glory, with Krupp steelworks producing cannons stamped with imperial NS rather than iron crosses. Yet cracks would inevitably appear in this imperial edifice. Napoleon's health was failing. Syphilis or stomach cancer would likely have killed him within a decade of Waterloo. His heir, the sickly Napoleon II, might have presided over a regency riven by factional strife between marshals like Ney and Soult. Russian Tsars, having seen French power reach their borders, could have sponsored covert rebellions from Poland to the Balkans. Most dangerously, the very efficiency of Napoleonic administration might have bred resentment. Tax collectors and conscription officers can standardize a continent, but they can't make it love its chains. The alternate 19th century could have witnessed two divergent paths, either a slow-motion collapse as nationalist guerrillas chipped away at French control, or a paradoxical modernization where Europe advanced technologically while regressing politically. Steam engines and telegraphs might have connected a continent that still knelt to an emperor's portrait. The revolutions of 1848, instead of demanding constitutions and nation-states, could have been desperate uprisings crushed by French-trained gendarmes. By the 20th century, this fossilized imperium might have faced a catastrophic reckoning, not a world war between competing powers, but a continent-wide revolt against the last vestiges of a system that outlived its founder by generations. Napoleon's near victory at Waterloo wasn't just a battle lost, it was the moment Europe chose fragmentation over forced unity, nationalism over imperialism. His triumph would have created a superstate neither democratic nor dynastic, but suspended in the authoritarian limbo between revolution and reaction. The roads might have been better, the laws more uniform, but the soul of nations would have languished in what the emperor himself once called the silence of the peoples. A French-dominated 19th century wouldn't just swap flags on colonial maps, it would rewire the machinery of modernity itself. Picture steam engines stamped with fleur-de-lis rather than British patents, their blueprints circulating from Lyon to Hanoi in a scientific lingua franca that never needed translation. Factories in Marseille might have outpaced Manchester's textile mills, while French colonial railroads in Senegal and Indochina could have eclipsed the British Rods network. The Industrial Revolution, so often associated with foggy London streets, might instead have been born under Mediterranean sun, its rhythms set by the Marseillaise rather than God Save the King. Language becomes the empire's most enduring export. Without British hegemony, French solidifies as the global tongue of commerce and diplomacy. Wall Street brokers conduct deals in Parisian accented French, while Shanghai's trading houses keep ledgers in elegant cursive script. Hindi and Arabic absorb French loanwords instead of English. Imagine Mumbai businessmen discussing le weekend over le café rather than taking a break for tea. Even technology terminology diverges. Where our world speaks of computers and software, this alternate universe might use ordinateurs and logiciels, with Silicon Valley relocated to a tech hub near Toulouse. The very structure of international communication would lean toward Latin clarity rather than Germanic adaptability, favoring precision over flexibility in ways that could alter scientific collaboration or legal treaties. Cultural landscapes shift just as dramatically. The Louvre, not the British Museum, becomes the template for global institutions, its encyclopedic collections setting the standard for how civilizations display their heritage. Shakespeare's plays, instead of dominating global theatre, might share the stage with Racine and Molière, their poetic Alexandrines echoing in schools from Quebec to Cambodia. The novel as an art form could have evolved along different lines without Dickens' serialized narratives. Literature might favor the psychological depth of Flaubert or the social panoramas of Zola. Even music would transform. Opera houses from New Orleans to Hanoi might prioritize Bizet over Verdi, while the syncopated rhythms of jazz blend with French folk melodies instead of English music hall traditions. Economic systems would wear an unmistakable Gallic imprint. The British Empire ran on laissez-faire capitalism and free trade, but France's dirigiste approach, state-directed industrialization, might have created a hybrid model blending private enterprise with centralized planning. Colonial economies could have emphasized infrastructure over extraction, with railroads and ports built to integrate territories rather than just export raw materials. The Franc zone, historically limited to parts of Africa, might have expanded into a global currency bloc, its value pegged to Parisian banks rather than London's gold standard. Even labor movements would diverge. Where British unions organized around craft guilds, French-inspired syndicalism could have spread worldwide, emphasizing general strikes and worker cooperatives over incremental wage bargaining. The darkest ramifications emerge in colonial policy. France's mission civilisatrice ideology, the belief in assimilating colonized peoples into French culture, might have been imposed with even greater fervor on a global scale. Vietnamese children in Saigon, Algerian farmers in the Atlas Mountains, and Iroquois hunters in Quebec could have been taught that their ancestors were Gauls. Their histories were written to fit a Parisian narrative. Yet there's a perverse silver lining. French colonialism, for all its brutality, legally considered assimilated subjects as French citizens, a fiction Britain rarely entertained. Over generations, this might have created a more ethnically diverse metropole, where Senegalese senators debated in the National Assembly and Vietnamese engineers designed Parisian skyscrapers, though always under the shadow of cultural erasure. Technological innovation follows distinct pathways. Britain's island geography fueled naval advancements, but a France spanning continents might have prioritized land-based marvels. The Montgolfier brothers' balloons could have evolved into airship networks decades before Zeppelins, linking Dakar to Damascus via floating salons. Early computers, instead of emerging from Bletchley Park's codebreakers, might have been born in the laboratories of Marie Curie's successors, their algorithms written in Algiers or Pondicherry. Even the atomic age could have worn different fingerprints without British and American scientific rivalry. The Manhattan Project's urgency might never have existed, delaying nuclear weapons or dispersing their development across multiple imperial laboratories. Yet the empire's fragility lurks beneath its grandeur. France's tumultuous 19th century revolutions in 1830 and 1848, the chaos of the Paris Commune suggests that even a victorious Napoleonic system would face internal fractures. A global empire might have strained under ideological contradictions, proclaiming liberty while denying it to colonized peoples, espousing reason while leaning on authoritarian rule. The 20th century could have witnessed not world wars between nations, but a planet-wide revolt against Parisian overreach, or worse, a French-led descent into totalitarianism that made our timeline's fascism seem provincial by comparison. The true measure of this alternate world lies in its ghosts, the English-language poets never born, the Manhattan skyline never built, the Beatles strumming guitars in Liverpool dive bars that remained provincial backwaters. A French 19th century wouldn't just replace one empire with another. It would redefine what ambition looks like, what progress costs, and whether the light of civilization can ever truly emerge from the shadow of control. The cannons fell silent at Appomattox in 1865, but what if Robert E. Lee's starving army had somehow broken through Union lines? A Confederate victory wouldn't just preserve slavery, it would fracture North America into competing nations, delay civil rights by generations, and scramble the alliances that fought 2 world wars. Picture a 20th century where Dixie's cotton barons wielded global influence while industrial powers jockeyed to exploit a perpetually divided continent. Slavery's longevity becomes the most immediate horror. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected the institution, making abolition nearly impossible without total military defeat. Instead of emancipation, the post-war South might have doubled down, mechanizing plantations with steam-powered cotton gins and railroad networks to transport enslaved laborers deeper into expanding territories. By 1900, slavery could have evolved into a grotesque hybrid of ancient brutality and industrial efficiency, with companies like Standard Oil leasing workers from plantation conglomerates. International pressure would mount, but the Confederacy's strategic cotton exports might have forced Britain and France to tolerate its peculiar institution well into the 1920s. The moral arc of the universe wouldn't bend toward justice here. It would snap under the weight of entrenched economic interests. North America's political fragmentation would be equally destabilizing. The victorious Confederacy would likely claim not just the 11 seceding states, but also Kentucky, Missouri, and Arizona territory, creating a slaveholding republic stretching from the Potomac to the Rio Grande. The rump United States, humiliated and bankrupted by war, might have faced further breakaway movements, New England abolitionists declaring independence, California forging a Pacific Republic, or indigenous nations like the Cherokee exploiting the chaos to reclaim sovereignty. Without a dominant central government, transcontinental railroads could have become contested borderlands rather than unifying projects, leaving the West a patchwork of feuding territories. Global conflicts would unfold along unrecognizable lines. In World War I, a balkanized North America might have prevented U.S. intervention, leaving France to bleed out under German onslaught in 1918. The Confederacy, culturally tied to Britain but economically dependent on German chemical imports for fertilizer, could have played both sides, shipping cotton to Lancashire mills while secretly selling Texas oil to Kaiser Wilhelm's U-boats. World War II becomes even darker. Without American industry, Britain collapses by 1941, leaving Nazi-dominated Europe facing off against an isolationist rump U.S. and a Confederacy that modeled its racial policies on Nuremberg laws. The atomic bomb might never have been developed, or worse, detonated over Richmond by a desperate Churchill trying to break the Axis. Civil rights movements take radically different forms. Without Reconstruction's fleeting gains, Black Americans in the South remain chattel, while those who fled north face constant threat of extradition under fugitive slave agreements. The Harlem Renaissance never blossoms. Instead, abolitionist literature is smuggled from Canadian printing presses or broadcast via underground radio from Mexico. International shame might eventually force Confederate elites to rebrand slavery as contract labor, but systemic oppression would persist through debt peonage and convict leasing. A delayed and decentralized civil rights struggle could have coalesced around unexpected leaders, Native American activists forging alliances with black guerrillas in the Ozarks, or Jewish refugees from Europe turning Appalachian coal towns into hubs of resistance. Technological and cultural development splits along parallel tracks. Confederate invention would focus on agricultural automation, mechanical cotton pickers patented in Atlanta rather than Detroit's assembly lines. The rump U.S., deprived of southern markets but free from slave state obstructionism, might have accelerated women's suffrage and labor reforms, becoming a progressive enclave sandwiched between reactionary powers. Jazz, born from the collision of African rhythms and European harmonies, could have remained confined to clandestine gatherings in border state speakeasies, its global influence stifled by cultural isolationism. Even something as mundane as time zones might never have standardized, with each fractured nation keeping its own arbitrary clock. The darkest legacy of Confederate victory isn't just the suffering it would perpetuate, but the futures it would foreclose. No integrated military to desegregate schools by example, no civil rights acts inspiring global anti-apartheid movements, no American superpower to counterbalance 20th century totalitarianism, just a fractured continent where the ghosts of Appomattox haunt every negotiation, every border skirmish, every whispered prayer for freedom. The Civil War wasn't just a battle over union or slavery. It was a fight over whether the modern world would be built on equality or exploitation. And in this chilling alternate timeline, exploitation won. A victorious Confederacy wouldn't just reshape America. It would send shockwaves through the global balance of power. Picture European empires eager to undermine a fractured United States, courting Richmond's diplomats with trade deals and military alliances. King Cotton's reign could have extended far beyond southern fields, weaving the Confederacy into the colonial ambitions of Britain and France. These weren't just potential trading partners, they were fellow imperial powers with a vested interest in preserving systems of racial hierarchy and cheap labor. Britain's calculus was particularly treacherous. Despite public abolitionist sentiment, the textile mills of Manchester and Liverpool depended on southern cotton. A Confederate win might have tempted London to officially recognize the breakaway nation, granting it legitimacy in exchange for preferential trade terms. The Royal Navy could have found itself patrolling the Caribbean to protect Confederate sugar plantations in Cuba, purchased from Spain in a reckless bid for expansion. Meanwhile, Napoleon III of France, already propping up a puppet regime in Mexico, might have seen an independent South as the perfect buffer against Yankee interference in his New World ambitions. Together, these alliances could have turned the Confederacy into a de facto colonial power, its envoys sitting at the table alongside British and French imperialists carving up Africa at the Berlin Conference. The geopolitical ripple effects would stretch to the Pacific. With America weakened, Russia might never have sold Alaska to the Union, leaving the territory to become a Tsarist outpost or falling into British hands. Japan's Meiji reformers, observing a divided North America, could have delayed opening to the West, or worse, allied with the Confederacy as a fellow feudal society modernizing without upending its rigid social order. Even the scramble for China would take a darker turn. Confederate merchants, excluded from northern industrial markets, might have joined European powers in imposing unequal treaties on the Qing dynasty, flooding Shanghai with slave-grown tobacco and cotton instead of New England textiles. Abolitionist movements worldwide would face existential threats. Brazil, the last Western nation to outlaw slavery in 1888, might have clung to the institution longer with a powerful slaveholding neighbor to the north. African kingdoms resisting colonial rule would lose a symbolic ally. The United States of our timeline occasionally supported Liberia and Ethiopia, but a Confederate-influenced America would likely side with European oppressors. Even the Haitian Revolution's hard-won freedom could have been reversed under joint Franco-Confederate pressure, with former slaves forced back onto sugar plantations under the guise of apprenticeships. Yet the contradictions of this alliance would eventually surface. Britain's industrial economy depended on southern cotton, but its moral posturing as an abolitionist power created tension. The moment Confederate slavery expansion threatened India's cotton production, or worse, inspired restive colonial subjects to compare their plight to enslaved Africans, London might have pivoted to undermine Richmond. France, too, would find itself torn between Catholic missionaries decrying slavery and plantation investors profiting from it. The Confederacy's dream of joining the Imperial Club could have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving it isolated as global opinion turned decisively against human bondage. The most chilling legacy might be ideological. A surviving Confederacy would have provided intellectual fuel for 20th century fascism decades early. Apartheid South Africa's architects and Nazi racial theorists alike could have pointed to the Confederate model as proof that industrialized white supremacy was viable. The Atlantic slave trade's horrors might not have ended in the 1800s, but evolved into state-sponsored trafficking well into the age of airplanes and telephones. The very concept of human rights would face an uphill battle in a world where one of the wealthiest nations built its economy on chains. In the end, a Confederate world power wouldn't just alter borders, it would poison the moral arc of modernity itself, turning the 19th century's march toward emancipation into a grim parade of reinforced oppression. The battlefields of Virginia and Georgia decided more than the fate of a nation. They were the front line in a global struggle over whether the future belonged to inclusion or exploitation. And for millions born into bondage, that struggle was never hypothetical. The rejection letter from Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts in 1907 carried more weight than anyone could have imagined. What if that verdict had been different? A young Adolf Hitler, his sketchbook brimming with architectural drawings, might have faded into obscurity as a middling landscape painter rather than emerging as history's most notorious tyrant. But removing one man from the equation doesn't guarantee peace. It rewires the entire 20th century in ways both hopeful and horrifying. Without Hitler's demagoguery, Germany's interwar chaos might still have birthed dictatorship, just not the genocidal nightmare we remember. The Treaty of Versailles' crippling reparations and the Great Depression's devastation created fertile ground for extremism. A different far-right leader, perhaps the more calculating Hermann Göring or the ideologically rigid Rudolf Hess, could have exploited nationalist anger without Hitler's singular obsession with racial annihilation. The result, a fascist Germany that still rearmed and annexed territories, but avoided systematic genocide, turning Eastern Europe into an economic satellite rather than a slaughterhouse. The Holocaust's 6 million Jewish victims might have endured brutal discrimination but not industrialized murder, while Roma, disabled, and LGBTQ+ communities faced persecution rather than extermination. Military timelines diverge dramatically. No Hitler means no reckless invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, sparing 30 million Soviet lives and preventing the Eastern Front's apocalyptic battles. Britain might have negotiated an uneasy peace with a less ideologically driven Reich, leaving Nazi-aligned regimes in France and Spain to fester. The United States, without Pearl Harbor's provocation, could have remained isolationist. No D-Day, no nuclear bombs dropped on Japan, and no American superpower emerging from wartime industry. The atomic age might have dawned differently, with German scientists like Heisenberg or British researchers at Cambridge leading the nuclear race instead of Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project. The Cold War's contours shift beyond recognition. A surviving fascist bloc in Europe would have forced Stalin's USSR into permanent siege mentality, diverting resources from global revolutions to border fortifications. Without Hitler's invasion weakening the Soviet Union, communism might never have expanded into Eastern Europe, but equally, a contained USSR could have turned even more repressive internally. The space race, historically driven by superpower rivalry, might not have occurred at all, leaving satellites and moon landings delayed by decades. Meanwhile, decolonization in Africa and Asia would unfold against a backdrop of competing authoritarian models rather than democracy versus communism binaries. Art itself becomes an eerie footnote. Hitler's artistic failures fueled his contempt for modernist, degenerate art. But with him painting postcards in Vienna, the Nazis might never have looted Picasso's Guernica or driven Bauhaus innovators into exile. 20th century culture could have retained more avant-garde experimentation, though fascist states elsewhere might still have suppressed dissent. The Surrealist Manifesto might have been written in a Paris free from swastika flags, while Jewish composers like Mahler and writers like Kafka inspired generations instead of perishing in death camps. Yet the darkest question lingers: was Hitler an aberration or a symptom? The antisemitism, expansionism, and nationalist fervor that fueled Nazism existed long before his rise. Without him, those poisons might have metastasized more slowly through populist movements in France, colonial atrocities in Belgium, or apartheid regimes in South Africa. The 20th century's horrors weren't conjured by one man, they were choices waiting to be made. His paintbrush, had it found success, might have spared millions, or simply left history's darkest chapters to be written by someone else's hand. A world where Germany never pursued the V2 rocket program sends shockwaves through technological history. Wernher von Braun's team, instead of being whisked to America under Operation Paperclip, might have remained obscure engineers tinkering with combustion engines in Munich laboratories. The urgent wartime competition that birthed jet engines, radar, and early computing could have stalled by decades. No Nazi fear of Allied bombers means no desperate funding for breakthrough aviation technologies. Britain's radar network, America's Manhattan Project, even the Soviets' tank innovations all emerged as direct responses to the existential threat posed by Hitler's war machine. Without that pressure cooker environment, the transistor might have remained a Bell Labs curiosity well into the 1960s, delaying the digital age's dawn. Space exploration stumbles without its original catalyst. The V2's legacy stretched far beyond London's bombed neighborhoods. Its technology became the skeletal framework for both American Redstone and Soviet R-7 rockets. No Nazi missile program means no Sputnik panic in 1957, no Apollo program to prove Cold War superiority. Yuri Gagarin might have retired as an obscure Soviet test pilot rather than the first human in space, while Neil Armstrong could have spent his career teaching aeronautics at Purdue University. The entire infrastructure of satellites, weather forecasting, global communications, GPS might have developed as late as the 1980s, leaving 20th century navigation dependent on sextants and radio beacons. Decolonization veers onto a radically different path. World War II shattered the myth of European invincibility, empowering independence movements from India to Indonesia. Without Nazi Germany crippling Britain and France through 6 years of total war, colonial powers might have clung to their empires well into the 1970s. India's independence in 1947 came partly because bankrupt Britain could no longer afford its crown jewel, but a financially stable colonial system could have resisted Gandhi's protests with brutal efficiency. Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, rather than defeating a war-exhausted France at Dien Bien Phu, might have faced fresh legions of Foreign Legion troops backed by uninterrupted metropolitan industry. The psychological blow of European weakness was equally crucial. Japanese victories over British forces in Singapore and French forces in Indochina proved Asian armies could defeat white rulers, a revelation that fueled anti-colonial confidence worldwide. No Pacific War means no Burmese independence hero Aung San cutting deals with Tokyo, no Indonesian nationalists like Sukarno exploiting Dutch weakness during occupation. Africa's liberation movements, historically inspired by India's success, might have delayed their campaigns until the 1960s or beyond. The Algerian War, Mau Mau uprising, and other bloody conflicts could have been postponed or prevented, but at the cost of prolonging systemic oppression. Economic dominoes tumble in unexpected directions. America's post-war dominance relied on Europe's devastation without lend-lease debts and destroyed competitors. U.S. industries might never have achieved such overwhelming supremacy. The Marshall Plan's reconstruction billions wouldn't have existed, leaving European economies to rebuild organically but more slowly. Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank could have remained toothless forums rather than engines of dollar hegemony. Conversely, prolonged colonialism might have choked emerging markets. Korean steel industries and Nigerian oil fields could have remained extractive appendages of distant empires rather than launching pads for Asian tigers or African lions. The Cold War's chessboard lacks half its pieces. A stronger British Empire means no power vacuum in the Middle East for American and Soviet proxy battles. The Suez Crisis of 1956, which humiliated London and Paris, might instead have seen colonial powers brutally reassert control over Egypt without superpower intervention. Cuba could have remained a Spanish-speaking playground for European investors rather than a Soviet missile base. Most hauntingly, nuclear proliferation might have unfolded differently. Without the urgent precedent of Nazi atomic research fears, the Manhattan Project scientists may have lacked the political will to pursue doomsday weapons. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki may never have darkened human history. Yet the darkest question lingers beneath these speculations. Was the nightmare of Nazism the only force capable of breaking older systems of oppression? The war's unprecedented violence discredited racism, birthed the United Nations, and enshrined human rights in global consciousness, but at what cost? 20th century history suggests progress often emerges from catastrophe's ashes. Without Hitler's horrors forcing moral reckoning, the world might have inched toward justice far more slowly, leaving millions to suffer under subtler tyrannies. The rockets, revolutions, and rights we take for granted today might have remained unrealized dreams in a complacent century untouched by necessary fire. October 27, 1962, the day the world held its breath. What if Kennedy and Khrushchev hadn't stepped back from the brink? The 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis didn't just flirt with disaster. It brought humanity closer to annihilation than any event before or since. A single miscommunication, an overzealous submarine commander, or a faulty radar signal could have triggered an exchange that turned Cold War tensions into incinerated reality. The immediate aftermath wouldn't resemble Hollywood's nuclear apocalypses. It would unfold as a cascading series of collapses, each more devastating than the last. First, the firestorms, initial strikes on Washington, D.C., Moscow, and military bases worldwide would have killed tens of millions within hours, but the real horror lies in the domino effect. Crippled governments mean no coordinated disaster response. Fires rage uncontrolled, radiation sickness spreads among survivors, and supply chains disintegrate overnight. Cities that avoided direct hits starve within weeks as transportation networks fail. Hospitals overflow with patients suffering from burns and radiation poisoning, their dwindling medicine stocks looted by desperate mobs. The electromagnetic pulses from high-altitude detonations would fry unshielded electronics, plunging continents into pre-industrial darkness. No emergency broadcasts, no banking systems, just scavengers picking through the ruins of Silicon Valley and the Ruhr Valley alike. Nuclear winter's grim arithmetic takes center stage once the smoke clears. Modern climatology suggests thousands of warheads detonating on cities and oil refineries would loft millions of tons of soot into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight for years. Global temperatures could plummet by 10 degrees Celsius. Crops fail en masse from Nebraska to the Ukraine, triggering famines that make the Black Death look contained. Ecosystems already reeling from radiation would face acid rain and ultraviolet radiation through damaged ozone layers. The lucky ones might be those near ground zero. Those surviving the initial blasts would endure slow starvation, frozen summers, and the collapse of everything resembling civilization. Rebuilding becomes a question of who's left. Isolated pockets with pre-industrial skills, Amish communities, Siberian hunter-gatherers, Pacific Islanders, might fare better than advanced societies dependent on fragile supply chains. Enclaves in New Zealand or Patagonia, spared direct strikes thanks to their irrelevance to superpower geopolitics, could become improbable arcs for human continuation. But even they would face monumental challenges, relearning medicine without pharmaceuticals, forging tools from salvaged wreckage, and preserving knowledge as books decay in the nuclear twilight. The total loss of global trade means no spare parts for generators, no fertilizers for fields, and no way to restart technological progression without accessible mines or refineries. Cultural memory would fracture along haunting new lines. Oral traditions might replace written history as literacy becomes a rare skill, turning events like World War II into mythologized legends. Religions could splinter into cults worshipping the old world or demonizing technology as the source of divine wrath. The very concept of nations might disappear, replaced by feudal city-states battling over canned food depots and intact libraries. Future archaeologists sifting through 1960s ruins would face a chilling discontinuity, a layer of radioactive ash separating the vibrant artifacts of 20th century consumer culture from the crude pottery of post-apocalyptic survivors. Yet amid the devastation, glimmers of stubborn hope persist. Humanity has rebuilt before after ice ages, plagues, and volcanic winters. The difference this time: we'd know exactly what we lost. Generations raised on stories of skyscrapers and satellites might labor for centuries to recapture even fragments of that knowledge, their progress slowed by the need to first relearn fundamentals like metallurgy and chemistry. The real tragedy isn't just the lives erased in the initial exchange, but the centuries of potential medical breakthroughs, space exploration, artistic movements snuffed out before they could ever exist. The Cuban Missile Crisis didn't just threaten individuals, it gambled with the entire future trajectory of our species. In the radioactive twilight of a post-exchange world, the balance of power wouldn't vanish, it would slither into unexpected hands. China, spared the worst of the nuclear holocaust by its distance from US and Soviet targets, might have emerged as the reluctant hegemon of a shattered planet. With its industrial heartland intact and population still numbering in the hundreds of millions, the People's Republic could have pivoted from Maoist isolation to global stewardship overnight. Picture convoys of PLA engineers trucking solar panels across the irradiated ruins of Central Asia, not out of altruism, but because someone needed to keep the rare earth mines operational. The Great Wall's successors might not be forts, but sealed agrodomes pumping out genetically modified rice to stave off global famine. Neutral nations would become improbable superpowers overnight. Switzerland's alpine bunkers, stocked with decades of preserved food and hardened infrastructure, could transform from national redoubts to the de facto capital of a scattered European remnant. Brazilian rainforest communities, shielded by geography from fallout patterns, might find their sustainable farming techniques suddenly in global demand as traditional breadbaskets wither under nuclear winter. Even Ethiopia's highland farmers, long accustomed to subsistence agriculture, could become key players in a world where survival hinges on drought-resistant crops and low-tech resilience. The 21st century's great game wouldn't be fought with drones and cyber attacks, but with seed banks and water purification tablets. Technological development would splinter along bizarre new lines. With microchip factories reduced to molten slag, the digital age could regress to analog stopgaps, mechanical computers rebuilt from salvaged typewriter parts, radio networks powered by hand-cranked generators. Yet in isolated pockets, breakthroughs might accelerate unpredictably. Australian researchers in fortified outback stations, untouched by EMPs but cut off from global supply chains, could pioneer fusion power using lithium harvested from dead laptops. India's surviving Silicon Valley refugees might jury-rig AI models running on geothermal-powered mainframes, their algorithms optimizing radiation scrubbers instead of ad clicks. The Manhattan Project's successors wouldn't be building bombs, but cobbling together nanotechnology from microscope parts to clean poisoned soil. Environmental recovery would rewrite ecological textbooks. The ozone layer's partial collapse might trigger desperate geoengineering schemes, Swedish survivalists launching sulfur dioxide balloons to mimic volcanic cooling, or Kenyan biologists releasing CRISPR-modified algae to absorb atmospheric toxins. The sudden absence of industrial fishing could allow marine ecosystems to rebound in just decades, creating undersea Edens where mutated coral thrives alongside century-old tortoises. On land, radiation-resistant flora like sunflowers and mustard greens might dominate new biomass, their roots hyper-accumulating heavy metals while providing edible biomass. The Anthropocene's signature wouldn't be cities or farms, but these strange hybrid landscapes where nature adapts to human folly. Cultural evolution might prove the most radical transformation. Organized religions could fracture into solar cults worshipping the return of blue skies, or radiation-wary sects enforcing draconian purity rituals. Conversely, the trauma might birth a global secular ethos, a grim utilitarianism where every calorie is rationed for collective survival. Art would flourish in unexpected mediums, scavenged circuit boards assembled into mosaics depicting pre-war cities, or epic poems recited by firelight to preserve languages no longer written. The very concept of nationality might dissolve into tribal affiliations based on whose great-grandparents manned a functioning hydro dam or remembered how to forge steel. The darkest irony, humanity's worst self-destruction could have become its most unifying experience. Without the luxury of ideological divides, those who endured might have forged a planetary identity stronger than any UN charter. The nuclear shadows on Hiroshima's walls would find echoes in 1,000 makeshift memorials, each whispering the same lesson. Not that war is unthinkable, but that survival demands thinking differently. The Cold War's losers wouldn't be the capitalists or communists, but everyone who believed civilization was a guarantee rather than a fragile flame to be tended daily. The telegraph's staccato clicks hinted at something greater, a world where information could race across continents in seconds. Now imagine that potential unleashed a century early, with Charles Babbage's mechanical computers not as museum curiosities, but as humming hubs of a sprawling 19th century internet. This isn't just about faster communication, it's about rewiring the nervous system of the Industrial Revolution itself. Picture stock tickers in London parlors updating in real time as Bombay cotton prices fluctuate, or feminist pamphlets spreading through underground pneumatic tube networks faster than police sensors can burn them. The Victorian era's rigid hierarchies might have crumbled under the weight of instant connectivity. Industrialization would have rocketed forward at dizzying speeds. Factories linked by telegraph wires could coordinate supply chains with unprecedented precision. Manchester textile mills adjusting looms based on real-time demand from New York department stores. Steam-powered server farms near coalfields might have processed complex logistics algorithms, optimizing railroad schedules and canal traffic to prevent the gridlock that historically plagued 19th century transport. Even labor movements would gain teeth. Imagine Karl Marx broadcasting the Communist Manifesto through proto-blog platforms, inspiring synchronized strikes across Europe before monarchs could dispatch their cavalry. The Luddite uprisings might have evolved into something far more sophisticated. Hacker collectives sabotaging punch card systems that controlled automated weaving machines. Global finance would have transformed beyond recognition. The Rothschild banking dynasty famously used carrier pigeons to gain market advantages, now replace those birds with encrypted telegraph transfers settling in milliseconds. Colonial exploitation could have been both amplified and exposed. Rubber quotas in the Congo enforced through networked accounting machines, while abolitionists leaked plantation ledgers to horrified London newspapers via anonymous data packets. The gold standard might have collapsed decades earlier as digital transactions outran physical bullion shipments, giving rise to primitive cryptocurrencies backed by algorithmic trust rather than imperial vaults. Social reforms could have bloomed or withered under this new scrutiny. Frederick Douglass' speeches might have gone viral through mechanical news aggregators, forcing American slavery debates onto the global stage sooner. Conversely, governments could have weaponized surveillance technologies. Imagine a steam-powered Great Firewall filtering seditious content in Tsarist Russia, or social credit systems enforced through punch card citizen profiles in Victorian workhouses. The suffrage movement's petitions could have gathered millions of digital signatures overnight, but police might have tracked organizers through primitive IP logs tied to telegraph office registries. Scientific collaboration would leap across borders and disciplines. Darwin's Origin of Species manuscripts could have been peer-reviewed in days by biologists from Calcutta to Boston through academic bulletin boards. Marie Curie might have shared radiation data in real time with Nikola Tesla's research collective, accelerating nuclear physics by generations. Yet misinformation would spread just as fast. Homeopathy proponents flooding networks with bogus clinical studies, or phrenologists using early data analytics to prove racial inferiority with corrupted datasets. The darkest twist, this hyper-connected 19th century might have stumbled into total war long before 1914. Diplomacy historically relied on the cooling effect of slow communication, but with networked alliances triggering mobilization orders in hours rather than weeks, the complex web of treaties could have ignited a global conflict during the 1898 Fashoda crisis. Gatling guns might have been paired with primitive targeting computers, and zeppelins could have dropped bombs guided by telegraph-coordinated coordinates. Yet for all its potential horrors, this alternate timeline sparks an irresistible question. Would accelerated knowledge have tempered humanity's worst impulses or simply armed them with deadlier efficiency? The Steam Age Internet wouldn't just be a tool, it would be a hall of mirrors, reflecting both the brilliance and brutality of an era poised between enlightenment and empire. One thing's certain, the 19th century's quietest revolution wasn't in its factories or battlefields, but in the unrealized potential of the connections it almost made. The telegraph's copper veins didn't just carry messages, they pulsed with rebellion. By the 1850s, underground networks of radicals were hijacking imperial wires to coordinate dissent across continents. Hungarian revolutionaries in 1848 might have failed to break free from Habsburg rule, but imagine their counterparts a decade later, encrypted Morse code crackling between Budapest and Bombay, synchronizing uprisings with the precision of a Swiss watch. Colonial censors could burn seditious pamphlets, but intercepting every coded transmission was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Cultural identities would fracture and reform at lightning speed. Irish nationalists, historically isolated by geography, suddenly found their cause amplified through transatlantic cables linking Boston tenements to Dublin pubs. A single speech by Daniel O'Connell could ricochet from New York printing presses to Sydney labor halls within hours, forging a global Irish identity decades before the Easter Rising. Conversely, British imperial administrators weaponized the same technology, using telegraph-enabled railroads to crush the Indian Rebellion of 1857 with terrifying efficiency. Sepoy mutineers in Delhi learned too late that their tactics were being telegraphed to British garrisons in Calcutta before the ink dried on their manifestos. The political chessboard tilted on its axis. Otto von Bismarck, the master manipulator of realpolitik, wouldn't just rely on spies and ambassadors. He'd have instantaneous updates from Prussian consulates in Paris and Vienna, adjusting his schemes like a puppeteer with wires strung across Europe. The delicate dance of diplomatic alliances transformed into a high-stakes game of telegraphic brinkmanship. One missent cipher could spark a war, as nearly happened in 1870 during the Ems telegram incident. Now picture that volatility compounded by networked revolutionaries. Marx and Engel's Communist Correspondence Committee evolving from a sleepy London salon into a shadowy clearinghouse coordinating Paris Commune-style uprisings from Berlin to Buenos Aires. Yet the most transformative effects might have been felt in the colonies. Dutch planters in Java couldn't suppress news of the abolitionist movement once telegraph lines reached Batavia. Enslaved workers on Sumatran rubber plantations might have staged work stoppages timed to coincide with abolitionist speeches in Amsterdam. Separatist movements from the Philippines to Algeria could have shared tactics through anarchist bulletin boards transmitted via undersea cables. The British Empire's greatest strength, its ability to project power globally, would have become its Achilles heel when every punitive expedition was telegraphed to the world before the ships even left harbor. Religious revolutions would burn just as brightly. The papacy's grip on doctrine loosened as liberal Catholic theologians in Germany debated ultramontanists in Rome through semi-public telegraph exchanges. Islamic reformists from Cairo to Calcutta might have used coded Quranic verses transmitted via Ottoman relays to challenge conservative ulama, sparking theological debates that bypassed traditional centers of learning. Even the Baha'i Faith's universalist message could have spread exponentially faster, its Persian founders coordinating with disciples in Chicago and Haifa through networks that made the medieval Silk Road look like a village footpath. The darkest twist, this hyper-connected 19th century might have accelerated exploitation alongside emancipation. Belgian King Leopold's Congo atrocities were exposed in our timeline by brave journalists, but what if his agents had controlled the telegraph hubs, flooding Europe with fabricated reports of civilizing missions while silencing dissenting voices? Automated looms in Lancashire cotton mills could have been synchronized with slave labor harvests in Mississippi via Atlantic cables, creating a nightmarish feedback loop where real-time demand spikes triggered whips cracking on distant plantations. The same wires that carried abolitionist manifestos might also have transmitted auction block inventories, digitizing human suffering into cold columns of Morse-encoded ages and defects. Ultimately, the steam-powered information age reveals a paradoxical truth. Technology doesn't dictate morality, but it does amplify humanity's capacity for both liberation and cruelty. The telegraph didn't just speed up communication, it compressed history itself, forcing kings and revolutionaries alike to play their hands at a pace that left slow thinkers in the dust. The empires that adapted thrived. Those that failed to grasp the power of instant connections found their borders redrawn by rebels wielding nothing more than a telegraph key and a vision of a different future. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium still glints over the Golden Horn, its wings spread protectively between Europe and Asia. What if that symbol hadn't fallen in 1453? A Byzantine empire surviving into the modern age wouldn't just be a historical curiosity. It would have reshaped the clash of civilizations, the flow of knowledge, and even the map of the Middle East. Picture Constantinople's Theodosian walls standing unbreached, its libraries preserving Greek and Roman texts that Europe spent centuries laboriously rediscovering. The Ottomans, denied their imperial capital, might have fractured into competing beyliks, leaving Anatolia a patchwork of emirates rather than the unified powerhouse that threatened Vienna's gates. The Crusades would have played out on an entirely different chessboard. Without the Ottoman menace, the disastrous Fourth Crusade's sacking of Constantinople in 1204 might never have occurred. No schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. No Venetian merchants carving up Byzantine territory like a stolen feast. Instead, a strong Byzantium could have coordinated with European crusaders as allies rather than targets, directing their zeal south toward Jerusalem with a united front. The Kingdom of Jerusalem might have endured as a Byzantine client state, its knights supplied through Anatolian ports rather than relying on precarious overland routes. Even the Reconquista in Spain could have drawn inspiration from Constantinople's resilience, with El Cid's campaign seen as part of a broader Christian resurgence backed by Byzantine gold and diplomacy. Eastern Europe's destiny would fork dramatically. The Ottoman advance that historically crushed the Balkans and reached the gates of Vienna hinged on capturing Constantinople's strategic waterways. A surviving Byzantium means no siege of Belgrade in 1456, no Battle of Mohawks in 1526. Hungary and Poland might have formed an unbroken chain of Christian kingdoms shielding Central Europe. The Janissaries, the Ottomans' elite slave soldier corps, would never have been born without Byzantine children taken through the devshirme system. Russia's claim as the Third Rome after Byzantium's fall becomes hollow. Instead, Muscovite princes might have remained provincial warlords paying homage to Constantinople's patriarchs rather than inventing Tsarist autocracy. The Renaissance's intellectual fire would have burned brighter and sooner. Byzantium scholars fleeing westward after 1453 brought priceless manuscripts to Italy, sparking Europe's rediscovery of classical thought. With those texts never lost, Aristotle's works could have been studied continuously in Byzantine universities alongside Arabic commentaries from Baghdad and Persian mathematical treatises. The humanist movement might have emerged from Thessaloniki rather than Florence, blending Greek philosophy with Orthodox theology in ways that made Luther's Reformation unthinkable. Even the scientific revolution could have taken root earlier. Imagine Byzantine astronomers collaborating with Copernicus on heliocentric models, or Leonardo da Vinci sketching his inventions in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia's massive dome. Religious landscapes fracture along unforeseen fault lines. Islam's expansion into Europe historically relied on Ottoman conquests. Without Constantinople's fall, the Balkans might have remained an Orthodox Christian stronghold, altering the demographic balance of modern nations like Bosnia and Albania. The Great Schism of 1054 between Catholic and Orthodox churches could have healed under pressure from a common Islamic threat, creating a unified Christendom that negotiated with the Muslim world from strength rather than fragmentation. Alternatively, Byzantine emperors might have played the divide and rule game more deftly, using Venetian merchants and Seljuk mercenaries as counterweights to papal ambitions. The modern Middle East's borders would be unrecognizable. The Ottoman millet system, which organized subjects by religion rather than ethnicity, laid groundwork for today's sectarian conflicts. A Byzantine survival means no Sykes-Picot agreement carving up Ottoman lands after World War I. Instead, Greek-speaking administrators in Antioch and Alexandria might have overseen a federalized Levant where Maronites, Druze, and Melkite Christians negotiated power-sharing agreements under the emperor's distant gaze. The very term Middle East might never have been coined, as British imperialists lacked an Ottoman rival to define themselves against. Yet the empire's greatest legacy could be its model of multicultural endurance. Byzantium perfected the art of absorbing conquerors, Arab naval tactics, Persian bureaucracy, even Turkish military reforms, without losing its core identity. A modern Byzantium might resemble a theocratic European Union, its bureaucrats speaking Greek in the corridors of power but Arabic in the markets of Damascus and Serbian in the vineyards of Belgrade. The euro could have been called the hyperpyron, its value pegged to ancient gold coins stamped with Christ Pantocrator. And when the 21st century's refugee crises erupted, Constantinople's gates might have remained open as they did for 1,000 years, not out of charity, but because the empire knew survival depended on turning strangers into subjects and subjects into Romans. The darkest irony, Byzantium's persistence could have made the world both more connected and more fractured. Its diplomats might have mediated between East and West, preventing colonial excesses, or it could have become an imperial fossil, stifling reform in the name of tradition. The Hagia Sophia's mosaics would still glitter unveiled by Muslim conquerors, but at what cost? Perhaps the empire's true lesson isn't how much better history could have been, but how fragile our assumptions are about the way it had to unfold. The Byzantines themselves had a saying, "Life is a wheel, what rises must fall." In this alternate timeline, that wheel never stopped turning. Constantinople's skyline in this alternate 21st century would dwarf even the wildest dreams of its medieval emperors. Imagine the Theodosian walls not as ruins, but as the historic core of a sprawling metropolis where glass and steel skyscrapers rise beside thousand-year-old domes. The Golden Horn, once a bustling medieval port, now hums with hydrofoil ferries zipping between continents, while subterranean maglev trains whisk commuters from European suburbs to Asian financial districts in minutes. This isn't just a surviving Byzantium, it's a hypermodern theocracy where the patriarch's blessings launch spacecraft, and blockchain-secured icons serve as both religious artifacts and national cryptocurrencies. Orthodox Christianity's global influence would operate on a scale unseen since the Great Schism. Instead of the Vatican commanding Catholicism's loyalty, picture a decentralized network of autocephalous churches, Russian, Greek, Serbian, all orbiting Constantinople as their spiritual capital. The Hagia Sophia's restored mosaics might beam daily liturgies to holographic congregations from Addis Ababa to Alaska, while AI-powered translation headsets let worshippers chant the Kyrie lesson in 100 tongues simultaneously. Missionary efforts could have taken an unexpected turn. Byzantine-sponsored clinics in sub-Saharan Africa dispensing both antibiotics and illuminated manuscripts, creating a syncretic blend of faith and science that challenges both evangelical megachurches and secular humanism. Geopolitically, this Neo-Byzantine empire would rewrite the rules of soft power. Where the United States exports Hollywood and the EU spreads regulations, Constantinople trades in sacred art and theological diplomacy. The International Atomic Energy Agency might share headquarters with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, issuing joint rulings on nuclear non-proliferation and the ethical limits of genetic engineering. Byzantine brokered peace deals could require warring factions to venerate shared relics before negotiations. Imagine Israelis and Palestinians jointly restoring a Byzantine-era mosaic as a precondition for talks. Even climate summits would carry orthodox fingerprints, carbon offset programs framed as modern-day Lenten sacrifices, with patriarchs declaring fast days against industrial overconsumption. Economically, the empire's survival would create a third pillar between Western capitalism and Eastern state dirigism. Byzantine guilds, descendants of medieval trade unions, might dominate industries from Aegean solar farms to Black Sea quantum computing hubs. The hyperpyron, pegged to both gold reserves and a basket of sacred commodities like incense and myrrh, could challenge the dollar and euro as reserve currencies. Pilgrimage tourism would dwarf Mecca and Varanasi, combined 30 million annual visitors walking the restored Mies Boulevard, their smart sandals automatically donating to cathedral restoration funds with each step. Yet the most fascinating upheaval might be technological. Byzantium's fusion of mysticism and pragmatism could have birthed unique innovations. Monasteries doubling as AI ethics think tanks, or geneticists consulting Byzantine medical manuscripts from the 9th century to rediscover forgotten herbal antivirals. The empire's legendary bureaucracy, digitized into blockchain ledgers, might offer citizens a startlingly efficient alternative to Western democracy's red tape, if you don't mind every tax form requiring an icon corner in your home office. Even space exploration carries orthodox flavors. Cosmonauts from the Byzantine-sponsored Star City on Crete would carry sanctified soil in their landing modules, planting vineyards on Mars in honor of Saint Tryphon, patron of vintners. The darker undercurrents of this world lurk beneath the gilded surface. A modern Byzantium would still grapple with its multicultural legacy. Armenian merchants in its bazaars, Muslim engineers in its aerospace sectors, and Jewish scholars in its academies might enjoy religious freedom, but always as protected minorities rather than equals. The empire's survival could have frozen certain social evolutions. Women might still be barred from the priesthood despite dominating secular offices, and LGBTQ+ rights could be caught between ancient canons and 21st century human rights charters. The schism with Rome might have hardened into permanent division, with Catholic and Orthodox cyber architects building competing metaverses for their flocks. Ultimately, Byzantium's endurance forces us to reconsider linear narratives of progress. A world where the Senate still meets beneath Constantine's porphyry columns isn't a medieval theme park. It's a living argument that tradition and innovation can intertwine in ways Western modernity never anticipated. The empire's true lesson might be that civilizations don't have to choose between preserving their soul and embracing the future. Sometimes the most radical act is keeping a flame lit for 17 centuries and letting its glow illuminate possibilities we've forgotten were ever on the table. We've traveled through a labyrinth of alternate histories where single moments, Alexander's fever, a messenger's delay at Waterloo, or a library's survival rippled into worlds unrecognizable from our own. Each twist reveals how fragile our present truly is, built on a shaky foundation of chance decisions and near misses. Imagine civilization speaking Greek instead of English, steam engines humming in Roman factories, or a Byzantine moon casting its glow over a unified Eurasia. These aren't just fanciful tales, they're reminders that history never moves in straight lines. Consider the weight of small choices. A failed artist's acceptance into art school could have spared millions from genocide. A single storm diverting the Spanish Armada might have left North America singing hymns in Latin. Even something as mundane as a trader's forgotten satchel could have delayed gunpowder spread by centuries, leaving knights in armor clashing on battlefields well into the industrial age. The past isn't just a sequence of events, it's a web of infinite possibilities where every thread pulled unravels a new reality. This journey challenges us to see our own time differently. The next 100 years could hinge on choices being made right now, technologies embraced or abandoned, alliances forged or broken. What if today's overlooked experiment becomes tomorrow's world-changing breakthrough? Or the politician dismissed as a fringe figure rises to reshape continents. History's lesson is clear: the future is never fixed, and neither was the past. Now it's your turn. What historical pivot points keep you up at night? Would you risk altering one event to prevent a tragedy, even if the consequences were unpredictable? Drop your own what-if scenarios below. We're all time travelers here, piecing together the roads not taken. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's tangled paths, hit subscribe. The next adventure is just one click away, and who knows, the story we explore next might just change how you see everything.